ladies and gentlemen, the moment that we have all been waiting for. To introduce Mr. Kennedy, Jamie McAfee, CEO of Corman.
Hey, everyone. So I know y'all want to get to RFK, but just to give a little introductory story, during the COVID pandemic, both my girlfriend and I, we got COVID really early, and we obviously tested positive, and then went through the next couple of years, and slowly we were living in the Northeast at the time. We felt like we were losing our civil liberties because we didn't get vaccinated, even though we were previously infected. And the science said, you might be immune if you're previously infected. We felt like second-class citizens. And so when Mr. Kennedy came out with his platform, we really felt like he was kind of speaking to our hearts. And, and then he came out with his Bitcoin policy. And I said, oh, man, I'm just in love with this guy. So please join me in giving a big, warm Texas welcome to the independent candidate, 2024 presidential election, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Well, welcome. 6 months ago, Bitcoin Miami, you launched your campaign. You have come a long way since then, sir. What do you attribute that to?
I think, I think people are ready for a change in this country. And I think you and I talked before we came out of here, particularly because it was a series of polls that came out. Let me ask first, can you guys hear us back there? Okay. You and I talked backstage a moment ago about our children, and we have kids who are roughly the same age. My kids are between 20 and 39. I think you said yours are between 18 and 32. I have 7 kids. And I'm doing better with kids. These recent polls that came out, there's 3 gold standard polls, Quinnipiac and a Harvard-Harris poll, which is Mark Pence's outfit. And the New York Siena poll that came out this week was a very big poll. It showed me leading President Trump and President Biden in young people who are under 45 years of age, and also people who are independent. These are the 2 key metrics. And I think the reason for that is that this generation of kids has lost hope in our country. There was a poll that came out in 2013 that showed that American kids between 18 and 34, when asked, are you proud of the United States of America? 85% of them said yes. The same poll taken a month ago, only 17% said yes. So in the terms of the last 2 presidents, the young people in this country have completely lost faith in the United States of America. More importantly, they've lost any hope in their own future. And we talked about this, and my kids, when I was that age, I was thinking of buying a home. I was, and my friends were. I have an older kid who's 39 who's in a home, but there are none of my other kids who are even conceiving of buying a home, and none of their friends are. And my kids all went to the best colleges, and they have great jobs. But purchasing a home is so far out of their purview at this point. And when I grew up and when you grew up, I'm 6 years older than you. The central foundation principle of the American dream was that if you worked hard, if you played by the rules, you could finance a home, you could take a summer vacation, you could raise a family, and you could put something aside for your retirement on one job. And there is nobody in this generation who believes that promise applies to them. And the probably the single greatest blow to them is that they're not going to get into a home. And a home ownership was critical to American prosperity. If you own a home, you care about your community, you care about the police, you care about your schools, you care about the transportation, the appearance of your home, and your neighbors. But more importantly, you care about, you have an entree to the American capitalist system. Because if you own a home, you have equity. You can borrow against it. And if you have an entrepreneurial impulse, you can assemble the capital to pursue it. You can build a restaurant. You can build a garage, a retail outlet. And after World War II, we had, the 50 years after World War II where you and I were raised is a period of time that economists call the Great Prosperity. Because during that period, the American middle class became the greatest economic engine in the history of mankind. When we were kids, our country owned half the wealth on the face of the earth. We were the biggest exporter of goods. Everybody wanted what we had. And we were a moral authority around the globe. And today, we're moving away from an ownership society to a renter society. And when you do that, you move away from citizenship to servitude. And that period of prosperity was kicked off by a housing boom. And it was a housing boom that was created by the government with the GI Bill and a series of other pieces of legislation that were passed after World War II that got an entire generation into homes. And that generation was able to borrow money, they were able to start businesses, and you had this ferment, this extraordinary ferment in every community around our country. And that can't happen today because in the last 2 years, the price of an average home in this country has gone from $215,000 to $415,000. And the interest rates, as you were talking about, the official interest rates have gone from 3% to 7%. But what a kid this age is paying, BlackRock, when it buys a house, it has a very low cost of money. But when your kid buys a house, he's got to deal with his own credit rating. And, he's paying 10% interest. And there's no way that anybody can afford it. And it's really a formula for strip mining the middle class of their wealth, of their equity, of their interest in this country. So this generation has lost hope. And, I was in San Francisco recently, and I tried the Monsanto cases in San Francisco in 2018. And we tried 3 cases in a row before Monsanto came and settled with us. But every morning before I went to court, I would go to the gym in Union Square. Union Square is like the Fifth Avenue of San Francisco. It has all the big American brands, Nordstrom's and Gap and Macy's and Bloomingdale's and Levi's and Old Navy. And all the foreign brands have flagship stores there like De La Valle and Prada, Gucci and Burberry and Ferragamo. Well, I went back there 3 weeks ago, and every one of those stores is closed down. They're closed, and there's just acre after acre of plywood. This iconic American city has been destroyed. Its economic heart's been torn out because of the chaos on the streets of the homeless population. When I left San Francisco, I started researching homelessness. My son, Connor, turned me on to a writer called Matthew Desmond, who's written the seminal works on homelessness. And my thoughts about homelessness was that it was probably driven by drug addiction, by mental illness, by extreme poverty, and that people who were homeless migrated to San Francisco for various reasons, for the weather and for their generous social safety net was famous. But what Desmond shows is that that's not true. Almost everybody homeless in San Francisco is from San Francisco. Drug addiction is a small part of it. There's places like West Virginia and Detroit that have much higher levels of drug addiction and no homelessness. Same with poverty. The mental illness is part of it, but most of those people who are homeless became mentally ill after becoming homeless. So what's causing it? The cause that Desmond shows is absolutely definitive is high housing prices. California has the highest housing prices in the country. And we have 525,000 homeless in this country. 50% of them are from California, unsheltered homeless, and California only has 12% of the population. And what Desmond shows is that this epidemic of homelessness that we're seeing in California is building like a tsunami, and it's about to sweep across the country. And when it does so, it's not only going to bring, the destabilization of losing all those homes and putting them into corporate control, but it's going to bring with it this social disintegration, the mental illness, the drug addiction, and all the other stuffs that are ultimately symptoms of homelessness. And, one of the reasons that I'm running is, and one of my promises is to get these kids in homes, to do whatever I need to do to restore the capacity of this generation to get into homes and become part of our country and become part of the capitalist system, full participants in the capitalist system.
And I think as we develop an economy of renters, what ends up happening, to your point, people don't care about their communities because they can just pick up and leave. And so when you don't have people taking care of their communities and investing in their communities, it's just like people not investing in the country. And I think that's something that we all, from an entrepreneurial perspective, want to make sure we continue to do is invest in the U.S. And in the Bitcoin community, we're very focused on innovation. We're doing a lot of things around energy. And I know you have some perspectives around Bitcoin that you think align with what you view this country should be doing. And I'd love for you to share that with the audience as well.
Yeah, I mean, my interest, I had no knowledge of Bitcoin at all at the beginning of the pandemic. My kids talked about it. My kids were all kind of entrepreneurial and curious. We're very attached to Bitcoin, and I saw something in them that I see in the entire Bitcoin community, which is this kind of idealism and a love for freedom and a belief that, of course there's greed and speculation like there is everywhere, but there's something unique about Bitcoiners that they're ideologically driven. They love freedom, and they see it as a path not only to their own economic security, but as a solution to a lot of the problems that are afflicting our nation. And in the same way that Silicon Valley was, rescued us from the sort of economic destruction in the 90s and 2000s that we now have, and made America the fulcrum for innovation and development and accumulation of wealth and imagination and culture, all of these wonderful things that came from the internet. We have the same capacity to do them with blockchain and with Bitcoin. And it almost is like a parallel track. But the real way I became interested in, and I've talked about this before, is during the trucker strike in Ottawa. So I watched the truckers, and I was in touch with them. And we had a reporter who was embedded with them. So I ended up spending a lot of time with the truckers. And if you saw the trucker strike, it was like Woodstock. It was this, this aggregation of people who were doing something that we take for granted in this country that we have a right to do, which is to assemble and to petition their government. And they were objecting to the lockdowns and some of the mandates that came along, but they weren't violent. There was nothing violent. It was the opposite of violence. They were, they had garbage patrols. They were bringing water to homeless people. It was this, really kind and compassionate protest. But the Canadian government didn't like it. And what the Premier Trudeau refused to meet with them. And then they used AI, they used facial recognition systems, they used all kinds of surveillance technologies to identify the truckers. And then they didn't charge them with a crime. They didn't convict them. They didn't notify them. They just shut down their bank accounts. And the truckers had millions of dollars. I believe it was about 12 million that they had collected through in PayPal from just private donors all over the country. PayPal simultaneously froze that account so they couldn't access it. And I was talking to truckers who could not purchase gasoline. They couldn't feed their children. They couldn't pay their mortgage. I had one friend who was a trucker who said he was in he had legal problems and that he could lose his freedom because he could not pay his court-ordered alimony bill because his accounts were all frozen. And it occurred to me at that point that transactional freedom was as critical a human right as the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of expression. Because if the government, if the government has the capacity to shut down your bank account, and starve you to death and get you thrown out of your home and make you so you can't feed your children, it has the capacity to make slaves of all of us. And it's important. I mean, if there's a guarantee of free expression, but the government then can punish you for expressing yourself by robbing you of your bank account, what's the purpose of the First Amendment? Oh, at that point, I started looking at how do we work around this? How do we prevent the government from monitoring every transaction, from giving us these kind of, which I could see at that point, the government was talking about as a COVID precaution, because they said currency is dirty. It's passing germs, so we're going to get rid of it. And if you know, at that point, they started removing ATM machines, like in Australia, even some in this country, but all around the world, as they were telling us cash is bad. And it looked like it was part of this panoply of totalitarian clampdowns that we saw during that crisis. And I could see where this was going, because I saw what happened in China where they had programmable currency, where if your credit rating drops below certain, your social credit rating drops below certain metrics, that the government can turn off your credit cards. They now have facial credit in China. So they can turn it off so that your facial credit will only work in for example, grocery stores that are within a certain radius of your home. And I saw that, and at that point, they were talking for the first time about digital currencies and about the central bank digital currencies. We got to switch to these because currency is filthy. And I immediately had anxieties, let's say, about going in that direction. So, and that's why I really started investigating Bitcoin. And the more that I learned about it, the more I fell in love with it, and fell in love with the community, because basically there's this huge overlap between libertarians and, people who love freedom and the Bitcoin community.
Absolutely. Fully decentralized, self-sovereign currency that governments can't control.
It's democracy. And it's a guarantee of democracy, that decentralization. It's the opposite of where they were sending us during COVID.
Yeah, there are a number of people in Washington, D.C. that still want a CBDC for all the reasons you just mentioned that you're afraid of. And that's something, hopefully, that won't happen. But do you think, as you look at the political parties and what they need to happen in this country, there's a lot of fear around national debt. There's a lot of fear around the economy, our children not wanting to invest because they're afraid inflation's taking the buying power out of their money on an everyday basis. When you're president, what are you going to do to give people faith and belief in the economy, that this is a country where people can innovate and grow, and they can develop new technologies, and we can become the strongest technological nation in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right now the federal government policy for this administration is to make war on Bitcoin and other digital currencies, to try, to have punitive taxes on the mining, to move us all toward ETFs and about to see central bank digital currencies. And I don't think there's anything wrong with ETFs on their own, as long as individuals can continue to have their own wallets and control their own Bitcoins. Otherwise, Bitcoin is just a digital currency that can be used to control us. And I don't think there's anything particularly wrong on its own about a central bank digital currency, except for the ease in transitioning us, out of control of our own wallets and our own nodes and those, issues that are critical for decentralization and democracy. But I do. If I become president, I'm going to make it. I think it's very important to keep that spirit, that this country is the hub of that spirit of innovation, not to chase cryptos out of this country, but to encourage the individual states and the nations itself, this spirit of innovation, and to make this the central hub around the world for digital currency. So we got to stop our war on them. We also should do stuff to encourage them. Ultimately, I don't think it's on principle, I don't think we should be taxed, levying capital gains tax on currency increases. I think it's tricky because right now, if you simply remove the capital gain tax, you would give a huge windfall to a lot of billionaires and to BlackRock and people who've accumulated. And I don't think that's a good policy. But I think people who are smaller owners and smaller traders should not be taxed for capital gains any more than if you had a Canadian dollar and it appreciated against the American dollar. You should be able to, that you should be taxed for that increase in value, when you cash them in. We shouldn't be treating it as a commodity. We should be treating it as a currency.
So if, as a Bitcoin miner, we believe that we help not just the economy, but we help the grid. We're helping the energy stability of this country, and we're doing things that allow us to use and convert things like methane, which is 80 times worse for the environment than carbon dioxide, convert that into heat, reuse that heat for other fruitful purposes. Clearly, Bitcoin mining in Texas has helped stabilize the grid in Texas. On the national level, if we're going to transition to renewable energy, we need to build grid infrastructure that's going to cost trillions of dollars over the next years. How should we as Bitcoin miners think about how more we can contribute to the energy system? Should we open up in more states? Should we get more states to accept what we do and bring us in and invite us to stabilize their grids? What are your thoughts around the energy side?
From an environmental point of view, there's a million ways that Bitcoin, there are miners who are using carbon-based energy, and but the economics of Bitcoin mining is pushing people towards the cheapest energy. And ultimately, when the halving occurs in April, that's going to become even more serious, because a serious incentive, a weighty incentive, because the cost, 80% of the cost of producing Bitcoins is energy costs. And so the economic model says you use the cheapest form of energy. The cheapest form of energy is going to be waste energy. It's going to be methane from landfills that you can then monetize, and then you can take that heat and you can use that, pump that heat into the grid, and we'd be able, and you should be able to monetize that. You can use agricultural waste and turn that into methane. You can, one of the, because I've built grid scale energy projects, solar and wind, and if we back when I was doing that, if we had had Bitcoin miners who would agree to use that waste energy and sign contracts for it, those projects would have become much more bankable. And of course, if you're building variable power, there aren't just necessarily certain times of the day when you are producing more energy than you can sell. And if you could monetize that incremental stream of revenue for that project, may be the difference between bankability for that project and not being able to fund it. Oh, there's a huge potential there, but I think, one of the things that we should think of is that, think about this, is one of the big problems, and it's one of the problems with using energy credits, is that you may be funding projects that are not profitable. And what we need to make sure is that every energy project, renewable energy project, is profitable. And the only way that we can do that is building out the grid system. And that will cost us, as you and I discussed, about $3 trillion. But if you think about that in advance and say, we can't spend $3 trillion to build out the grid, and let me tell you why that's expensive. We don't have a national unified grid that can move energy both ways and do it efficiently. Oh, if you're a South Dakota miner, I haven't looked. If you're a South Dakota farmer, and I haven't looked at these numbers recently. When I last looked at it, an acre of land, of cornfield in South Dakota was about $800, and an acre with a wind turbine in North Dakota, an acre with a wind turbine on it was worth about $3,200. So every farmer in South Dakota wanted to put turbines on their property. The problem is they couldn't sell their product because there is no, they wanted to sell it in Cleveland, Cincinnati, St. Louis, New York, New Orleans. But the current grid system, the electrons would disperse and diffuse before they cross the North Dakota border, as we don't have a good DC system that can do long-haul transport of electrons. And so we're wasting a lot of energy. We could supply the entire energy grid in this country with just wind power from North Dakota, Montana, and Texas. We could support the entire energy grid in North America with 75 by 75 miles square in the desert Southwest. You wouldn't do that because then if a cloud passed over Arizona, you'd black out the whole country. But, that's how little it would take. We're not doing that because we don't have a unified national grid. Now think about if you came along at the beginning of the ARPANET grid in 1979 and said, we can't afford this, it's going to cost us $500 trillion to maximize out the grid, you would have lost trillions and trillions of dollars in economic activity. So once you build that grid, it becomes a marketplace, and the marketplace drives efficiency. And I'm going to give you an example. In 1979, we built the ARPANET grid for the internet in this country. The following year, 1980, the CEO of IBM announced that IBM was getting out of the PC, the private personal computer business, because there was no money in it. It was a dead-end technology. Well, now a lot of other companies, Dell and many others, got out of that business because they didn't see what was going to happen with this marketplace. But then we built a marketplace. Now everybody has a personal computer. And what happened to the cost of bits and bytes of information? It went to zero. You imagine when I was in school, if I wanted to answer a question, if I was writing a book about Mao Zedong and wanted to find his favorite lunchtime meal, I'd have to go to the Library of Congress, work through the stacks for weeks to find that little piece of information. It would cost maybe tens of thousands of dollars. Today, you just pump it into a phone and you've got it instantaneously for free. So the cost of bits of information went to zero. The same thing will happen to electrons if we build a grid for energy, a national grid for energy. If in 1996, we built a national grid for telecommunications, Bill Clinton told all the baby bells, you have to unify your grid system. You have to create a marketplace, and the lowest cost provider will prevail in the markets. No more favoritism. What happened? All of these little devices like cell phones that we have today are the result of the revolution that took place because we built a national grid for telecommunications. And what happened to the cost of phone calls? When I was teaching at Pace University, I remember I made one phone call to London and it cost $75 for 5 minutes. Well, today it's free. It's free telecommunications forever as we built that grid. The same thing will happen if we build a national grid for energy. We turn every American into an energy entrepreneur, every home into a power plant. And we power this country on what Franklin Roosevelt called America's industrial genius, the innovation of our country, this entrepreneurial spirit, rather than Saudi Arabia oil or Appalachian coal. And that is what we ought to be doing, and that could benefit enormously from Bitcoin mining.
Mr. Kennedy, our time is up, but I have to compliment you. You are most probably one of the most articulate people to discuss the grid and Bitcoin mining in the political spectrum today. Thank you very much.
Fred, thanks so much for having me, and thank you to all your Bitcoiners. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey guys, thanks for coming out to the 2023 North American Blockchain Summit. It was the best summit yet. We look forward to hosting you again next year. If you enjoyed the summit or like what you saw in this video, be sure to subscribe. If you're interested in learning more about membership in the TBC, go to texasblockchaincouncil.org to learn more.